Dr. Sorev did not consider himself easy to surprise. A specialist in xenomedical trauma, he had seen organs regrown from raw protein, minds wiped and rebuilt after neurological firestorms, and skeletal systems restructured mid-surgery. He was not one to startle. But when the scanner finished its sweep over the Terran patient assigned to Medbay 3, he stopped mid-sentence and simply stared at the diagnostic. The holographic display rotated a 3D model of a human male 39 Earth years by record. Name, Daniel Royce, Planetary Logistics Advisor, and recently cleared for basic integration into the Joint Post-Conflict Assistance Team. His file showed no active symptoms. He had reported mild fatigue and intermittent left shoulder discomfort following a supply run, nothing urgent. Sorev had expected a minor muscle strain. Instead, the scan looked like a record of blunt history. He leaned in, silencing the background systems. The digital model shimmered in shades of bone white and blue-green, muscle overlaid with glowing red indicators. A cluster of healed rib fractures on the left side. Cortical thickening on 3 lumbar vertebrae consistent with repeated impact stress. A healed femoral shaft fracture in the right leg, remodeled without surgical aid. Signs of joint capsule compression in the left shoulder. Thermal scars lined the posterior thigh. Scar tissue was distributed across the abdomen in uneven patches, as though formed through regeneration without clinical supervision. Even more disturbing was the state of his internal organs. The spleen bore a healing marker from a prior partial rupture. The liver showed fibrotic tissue scarring. The right kidney sat slightly rotated in the retroperitoneal space, likely from an old contusion. The lung base displayed microcalcification, consistent with particulate inhalation. Sorev's primary interface flagged the scan. Unreported trauma cluster, recurrent historical injury indicators. He pulled a fresh readout, thinking there must be an error. The second scan confirmed it. The human sitting just 5 meters away was not recovering from one injury. He was the living evidence of dozens. Sorev stepped out of the analysis alcove and into the open partition. Daniel sat on the diagnostic bed, legs swinging slightly, sleeves rolled up. His boots looked worn, the soles dulled and the laces mismatched. He had that particular earthborn habit of leaning into discomfort, like stillness was optional. Sorev blinked twice. "Mr. Royce, I need to ask you about these findings." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Something broken?" "No. That's the strange part. Nothing is currently broken. But the scan shows at least 20 significant past injuries, some of them quite severe. The femur, for example, the ribs, multiple internal traumas. There is no record of treatment." Daniel shrugged one shoulder. "Didn't have time to die back then." Sorev paused. "Pardon?" Daniel smiled faintly. "Pretty sure you heard me." "I did. That is not an acceptable medical explanation." "Maybe not for you, Doc. For me, it worked out." Sorev tried again. "These are life-threatening injuries. Walking on a fractured femur without stabilization risks vascular damage, pulmonary embolism." "Yeah," Daniel nodded. "That one was rough. Collapsed tunnel, 2 civilians pinned. I hauled one out before the leg gave. Braced it with a metal bar, kept going for the other. Took a few days to swell up bad enough I had to crawl." "You crawled? On a broken femur? More of a drag, really. Would cause severe systemic inflammation." "Yeah, but the other guy made it out." Sorev felt something tighten behind his ocular ridge. He gestured toward the rotating scan. "Your liver has scar tissue consistent with blunt trauma. There are indications of internal bleeding at some point." Daniel exhaled through his nose. "That would have been at Jeroen. Ammo cache went up. I was tossed into a loader crate. Felt like a hot rock in my side for a while. Figured if I was still breathing, it wasn't worth stopping." "Mr. Royce, a hepatic contusion can escalate into multi-organ failure. I got lucky then." Sorev didn't speak for a moment. He turned the scan again. "What about the burns?" Daniel looked down at his thigh. "Refinery fire. Sealed a pressure breach before the main tank blew. You should have been in dermal regen for weeks." Didn't have a regen chamber, we were underground. The lung damage? Dust collapsed during a dig, no respirator. Didn't think I'd make it, but didn't want to slow the others down. Sorev moved back to the console. There was no indication of analgesic implants, no long-term pain management. Yet the records showed a full return to duty within days of each incident. No recorded hospitalization longer than 36 hours. You functioned like this. Daniel tilted his head. We weren't built to sit still. Sorev leaned forward. You weren't enhanced, not genetically modified. You don't have regeneration therapy. So how does a human process this much trauma and continue? Daniel scratched at his wrist. We don't process it, we pack it away and keep moving. That's not medical logic. Nope, it's just survival. Sorev tapped a control. The scan zoomed on the spinal cord. You should have chronic nerve damage. I probably do. Haven't had time to check. And the pain? You ignore it? I don't ignore it. I just know it's not the loudest thing in the room most days. Sorev stared. He had spent cycles studying Terran physiology, understood their systems, their tolerance thresholds. But he had never seen the consequences of sheer refusal so vividly illustrated. You shouldn't be able to operate at full capacity. Most of the time I don't. I just make it look that way. Why not stop? Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly. Because people needed me not to. Sorev took a step back. Not from fear, from realization. This wasn't a case of tolerance. It wasn't superior biology. It was something deeper, primitive and defiant, a survival instinct that didn't respond to logic or even necessity. It simply endured. I'd like to run a neuroendocrine profile, Sorev said slowly, and long-term inflammatory tracking. I need to understand what's happening inside you. Daniel nodded. You want blood? Yes. And a musculoskeletal panel. You can lie down if you'd like. Daniel scoffed. Reclining feels like giving up. Sorev moved to prepare the scan. His mind raced. He would need to rewrite parts of his thesis. Not because humans were tougher, because they didn't stop. Dr. Sorev adjusted the neural marker display as the scan completed. The readings were conclusive and quietly disturbing. Daniel's endocrine system was operating under a baseline stress profile consistent with moderate trauma. Cortisol levels were elevated, but not dangerously. In fact, they were oddly stable, not suppressed, not fluctuating, just integrated. That was not normal. He had expected some adrenal irregularities, possibly a heightened inflammatory marker trail or metabolic compensation. But the consistency of Daniel's system suggested something else, something long practiced. Sorev reviewed the neuromuscular response test. Muscle fibers showed standard fatigue patterns, yet still carried evidence of high-efficiency repair processes, not enhanced, just hardened. He traced through Daniel's pain mapping, numerous old injury sites, each associated with lingering receptor sensitivity, but his brain's response patterns were dulled, not deadened, not pathologically blocked, adapted. Daniel sat across the room, sipping from a small hydration pack, watching Sorev like someone waiting for a car to be fixed. Your system has normalized pain, Sorev said finally, not blocked it, not forgotten it. It just accepted it. Daniel looked at him. You're surprised? Yes. Pain is supposed to be a warning. Your body no longer reacts to it like one. It was never a warning for me. It was background noise. Then how do you know when something's truly wrong? When I pass out. That is not a viable threshold. It worked so far. Sorev set the pad down. You are carrying more cumulative damage than any other patient I've ever treated, and you are functioning within standard tolerance. Daniel shrugged. Better than some of the kids I trained with. One guy used to dislocate his shoulder every time he threw a grenade too hard. Still finished every run. Sorev shook his head. This is not a sustainable condition. Daniel smiled thinly. Survival's not supposed to be comfortable, Doc. It's supposed to work. Sorev's voice dropped. You don't think any of this deserves rest, recovery? Daniel looked away for a second. You rest when no one needs you. That's silence again. Not wounded, not deflective. Matter of fact. Sorev had once treated a Harketh miner who tore his own limb free during a cave collapse. The pain had shut his system down in less than a minute. He had to be revived with neurostims and rehydrated twice before he could speak again. Daniel had healed a broken femur in the field with scrap metal and kept going. Sorev opened the psych readout. Your dopamine pattern suggests you don't derive satisfaction from victory, only completion. Right, we call that getting it done. That is not how your species was originally categorized. Terran profiles suggested high emotion drive. Daniel shrugged. That was before half the planet burned. After that, we learned to hold the emotions till the job was done. Sorev studied him again. There's something in you that's made to move forward when everything else says stop. Isn't that how everyone survives? No, not like this. Daniel leaned forward slightly. Doc, I've seen friends hold their insides with one hand and drag someone else with the other. I've seen a guy walk half a click with a bullet in his spine because he thought maybe someone up ahead was hurt worse. That's not rare where I come from. That's just Thursday. Sorev sat back. What drives that? Daniel looked at him for a moment. You want the truth? Yes. Because dying is easy. Quitting's easier. And we're too damn stubborn to take the easy way out. It wasn't bravado. There was no triumph in his tone. Just grit. But yielding. Sorev turned back to the readings. Every marker told a story of agony, bypassed or absorbed. His mind couldn't reconcile the gap between what should have broken this man and what had merely delayed him. He tapped on the renal scans again. Your right kidney sits lower than expected, not enough to impair function, but clearly displaced from trauma. Daniel nodded. That's from the blast at Melian 3. Shoved me back so hard I bounced off a generator wall. Something snapped inside, pissed blood for 2 days. You should have been evac'd. No evac left, just us. And you worked like that? Yeah, it wasn't great. You risked renal failure. Well, it didn't fail, did it? Sorev stood abruptly, pacing once. You talk about it like this is normal, like a checklist. Daniel looked at him. What is it to you? It's impossible. Biologically, you are proof of something that should not happen. Daniel stood slowly. Doc, I don't know how your species handles things, but where I'm from, you get hurt, you get up. If you can't get up, you crawl. If you can't crawl, you drag. Until the job's done, or you're dead. Sorev spoke quietly. And if you do die? Daniel shrugged. Then I hope whoever's next keeps going. Sorev turned back to the console. His fingers hovered over the log field. Finally, he recorded. Patient displays high functional survival orientation exceeding expected neurological adaptation. Chronic trauma has failed to produce psychological destabilization. Biochemical feedback systems fully integrated. Pain no longer interpreted as resistance. Conclusion: human persistence is not circumstantial. It is fundamental. He closed the log and looked back at Daniel. You are the most dangerous kind of anomaly. Because I won't stop? Because you don't know how. Daniel smiled. Yeah, that sounds about right. Dr. Sorev spent the next 7 days quietly auditing every medical report that had ever crossed his terminal with a human name attached. What began as a single anomalous scan spiraled into a stack of clinical cases that no longer read as exceptions but patterns. A deep space rescue pilot who worked 12 hours with a cracked sternum. A planetary engineer who reset her own shoulder in the middle of an evacuation before carrying a child half a mile uphill. A communications officer who was found with both legs broken under collapsed debris, still directing rescue crews via shortwave until his lungs failed from dust inhalation. They weren't outliers. They were ordinary Daniel Royce wasn't the only one. He was just the first Sorev had seen up close. By the time Daniel returned for follow-up tests, Sorev had built a new neurodiagnostic protocol to assess not just trauma patterns, but how the human brain responded to threat, fatigue, and post-traumatic conditioning. He was cautious, subtle. He didn't want to trigger defense behaviors or psychological withdrawal. But Daniel didn't flinch. He took the tests like a physical challenge, not competitive, just steady, as if being studied was something he'd accepted before. "You ever do stress inoculation?" Sorev asked during one sequence. Daniel nodded. "Basic training. Cold exposure, sleep deprivation, simulated loss. You adapted quickly. No choice. You were evaluated afterward?" "Not really. If you didn't crack, they figured you were fine." Sorev frowned. "That seems insufficient." Daniel gave a small smile. "That's the point. We learned to carry damage, not cure it." The new scans confirmed what Sorev suspected. Daniel's amygdala was normal in structure but less reactive. His hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis response was compressed. His body released stress hormones efficiently but terminated them just as fast. His prefrontal cortex showed unusually high activity under simulated distress. He didn't freeze or collapse. He mapped decisions fast. It wasn't enhancement. It was pattern, learned behavior, neural pruning shaped by experience. A life spent riding the edge of damage, until fear and agony became reference points, not obstacles. During the final test session, Sorev sat beside him in the scan chamber, watching the bioscreen update in real time. "You don't blink much," Sorev said. Daniel shrugged. "Nothing to blink at." "That in itself is remarkable." "No, just habit." Daniel looked over. "Because blinking means you miss something once. You don't make that mistake again." Sorev paused. "What did you miss?" Daniel's voice stayed level. "Collapse at Reacher 7. I looked away for a second. Thought the line was holding. When I turned back, the support had failed. 2 people gone, never found the bodies." Sorev nodded slowly. "You blamed yourself. I made sure no one else had to. That's a heavy way to live." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Yeah." There was a quiet moment between them, longer than usual. Sorev tapped the pad again. "I've studied trauma responses for 32 Earth years. I've mapped pain psychology in 10 species. What I see in you isn't reflex, it's resolve." Daniel took a breath. "Resolve's not special, Doc. It's just what's left when everything else goes quiet." Sorev filed that away. Later that evening, after the scans, Daniel lingered in the doorway of the medbay. "You got a minute?" he asked. Sorev turned. "Of course." Daniel rubbed at his elbow, where an old scar crossed from joint to wrist. "The other day you said I don't know how to stop." "I did." "You're wrong." Sorev raised a brow. "Am I?" "I do know how," Daniel said. "I just don't want to." "Me not?" "Because the moment I do, someone else has to carry more weight." That quiet returned again. "You think it's your duty?" Sorev asked softly. "I think it's my turn," Daniel said. "And it's going to be someone's turn every day after me. I'd rather they get a break while I'm still breathing." That sentence lodged itself in Sorev's mind like a nail. He asked no more questions. Instead, he documented everything. The inflammatory stability, the pain resilience, the long-term neuroadaptive profiles. He built a file that would one day be reviewed by 3 planetary academies and a classified Terran liaison team. They would label it under Anomalous Human Recovery Profiles, but the real title would be far simpler: Refusal to Die. But none of it explained the final, quiet truth that Sorev wrote in the notes he never submitted. They survive because survival isn't a decision, it's a promise. He saw it again 2 days later. A storage platform in the orbital ring failed mid-transfer. 2 tons of alloyed crates collapsed, 3 workers were injured, 1 pinned. Daniel was off duty. He still reached the scene first. Zorev watched from the rescue pod, helpless behind sealed doors, as Daniel braced the girder with one shoulder and pulled a screaming engineer out by the back of his uniform. He did not flinch when the crate edge cut into his thigh. He did not slow when the servos strained against his back. He only stopped when the platform stabilized and the last crew member stood. Only then did he fall to one knee. Not from weakness, from completion. They airlifted him back to medbay. He had a deep muscular laceration and bruised ribs. He refused anesthesia. "Patch it clean," he said. "I've got work tomorrow." Zorev cleaned the wound in silence, then stitched it carefully. Daniel did not wince once. The next time Dr. Zorev stood over Daniel Royce, the human was unconscious. Not from blood loss, not from shock, but from pure exhaustion. 2 full cycles of emergency fieldwork had drained him. A hull breach on the refugee freighter had exposed half the population to vacuum. Daniel had been on duty when it failed. Without a suit, he'd rigged a seal using a heat panel and his own body, keeping the bulkhead sealed just long enough for the outer barrier to lock. Zorev had examined the video. 8 minutes. 8 minutes pressed against the vented edge, his shoulder blistering from the emergency panel's thermal output. His eardrums ruptured. His skin swelled from decompression exposure. He passed out only after the inner locks confirmed. By every standard metric, Daniel should have been rendered non-functional for days. But by the time they transported him back to the main station, he was already conscious. He wasn't speaking yet. Oxygen debt slowed his brain's speech centers, but his vitals were stabilizing on their own. They brought him into isolation. Zorev monitored every aspect: neural patterning, tissue perfusion, stress hormone response. His system, while strained, was correcting course. The scars were newer now: blistered shoulder, fluid in the lung bases, but healing had already begun. Zorev sat at his side as the monitors beeped softly. He recorded audio for the medical board, knowing it would be reviewed, but this message was more personal than professional. "This is Dr. Zorev, specialist in xenomedical trauma, orbital cycle designation 77QQ. Subject Daniel Royce continues to present with high functional endurance. Today's incident should have incapacitated him permanently. It did not. Recovery time is proceeding at nearly double baseline expectations for a human with no bioregeneration treatment. Pain suppression remains integrated, not artificially induced. Neurobalance returning. I am running out of ways to explain this." He looked at the sleeping form on the bed. Today he saved 19 lives, not by strategy, not by force, but by standing in a place no one else could. Or would. There was no protocol for that, just choice. He shut off the recorder. Daniel stirred an hour later, blinked a few times, sat up too fast. Zorev was already there with saline and a controlled breath mask. "You're stable, do not move quickly." Daniel adjusted the mask and blinked at the lights. "Is it morning?" "It's been morning twice since the breach." Daniel nodded. "Everyone all right?" "Yes." "Thanks to you?" "You need rest." Daniel's gaze sharpened. "Can't. We've got intake from that evacuation fleet. Triage is thin. I've doubled the roster, it's covered." Daniel narrowed his eyes slightly. "You did that?" "Yes." Daniel looked away. "Ha! You disapprove?" "No, just not used to anyone else planning for me." Zorev folded his arms. "Then get used to it. You're not alone here." Daniel didn't speak for a while. Zorev leaned forward. "Do you understand what you've shown us?" Daniel tilted his head. Zorev continued. "It's not your scars, not your bones. It's not the damage you carry. It's that you carry it at all. You shouldn't be standing, but you do. Again and again. And you never ask anyone to notice. You treat survival like an obligation." Daniel sighed. "It is. Way beneath." He looked directly at Zorev. "Because we come from a place that doesn't forgive mistakes. And I made some. So now, I make sure fewer happen. Zarev let that settle. It's not just biology, it's decision. And no simulation or enhancement could ever replicate that. I'm not the only one, you know. I do. But you're the one here. Daniel looked over the diagnostics. How bad? Your right lung is recovering from barotrauma, superficial dermal burns, electrolyte imbalance, but nothing permanent. Daniel laughed, soft and short. So, just another Tuesday? I will never understand how you normalize agony. Not normalized, just scheduled. Zarev shook his head. You should be dead. Probably. You didn't even hesitate. Daniel's eyes lost their focus for a moment. Didn't have time to. Zarev blinked. That's what you said during your first scan. Yeah, and I meant it. Do you still... Daniel's voice lowered. Always. Zarev took a breath. And what happens when you do have time? Daniel's face softened in a way Zarev hadn't seen. Not resignation, not fatigue, just a quiet, lived honesty. Then I'll rest. But not before. Zarev sat with that. The days that followed brought more ships, more injuries, more emergencies. But Daniel slowed, at least a little. He took half shifts. Zarev enforced them. They argued once, mildly, but Daniel accepted it. The human didn't stop. But he paced himself. For the first time. Weeks later, Zarev received a transmission. It came from a central registry board, a formal inquiry into Terran endurance patterns. They wanted his notes, his scans, his interviews. He submitted everything. But before closing the file, he added a private annotation. They are not resilient because they were made stronger. They are stronger because they cannot imagine stopping. Pain is information. Damage is inconvenience. But giving up, that's not written into their bones. It's buried beneath them, and they refuse to dig that deep. When Daniel walked in for his final checkup, Zarev smiled without pretense. You look terrible. Daniel grinned. Feels like progress. You're clear for duty. Modified rotation only? Daniel nodded. Thanks, Doc. Don't make me regret it. Wouldn't dream of it. As Daniel left, Zarev turned back to the final image on his screen. A perfectly average human, and the most immovable force he'd ever met.